We've spent almost a year getting all our pieces ready, and now we're ready to put them all together. The first thing you want to do is take your house block and press it well so that it's flat. We're going to trim this block down to 23.5 inches. I don't even have a ruler that's big enough for that. So what I did mark my center lines. You can just go with your crease if you want to. I used a Frixion pen, which usually comes out with heat. I'm going to gamble on this one. Sometimes on red it will leave a kind of a ghost. Because it's 23.5 inches, I measured from the center, so out from this line and up from this line, 11 3/4 inches, because that's half of it. I marked this corner and then I just turned the ruler and kept marking. So if you have at least a 12-inch ruler, you could do it that way. Otherwise, you could draw your 23.5-inch square on a piece of paper that is wider than what freezer paper is. You could piece your freezer paper together. You could use Sulky Totally Stable to draw a square, but I've just drawn it out on here, and when I'm satisfied, then I'm going to trim off the extra. So I'm just lining it up with those lines that I marked and cutting. Oops. On all four sides, so you get a square again that's 23.5 inches. One of the things in your kit this month is a pink strip that is about 6.5 inches by 27 inches. I have already done my spray starch sizing, best press, whatever you want to call it, and we need to trim this down or subcut this into 4 1.5-inch strips. 27 inches is longer than my longest ruler, so I'm going to fold it in half, keeping it as straight as I can. There's probably one edge that's going to be straighter than the other, and I gave you wider than 6.5, so you should be golden. I'm going to clean cut one edge, and then I'm going to rotate 1.5 times 4 is 6 inches, so you could line up your ruler with a 6-inch mark. I would rather not line it up with the edge of the ruler. I'd rather use a line, so I'm going to go 4.5 and cut. Then I'm going to go 3 and cut, and then 1.5 and cut. Move those 3 out of the way and come back and cut my last 1.5-inch strip. I need to cut 2 of my strips down to 23.5 inches. Rather than trying to measure it out the whole length, I'm going to go ahead and leave it folded in half. So half of 23.5 is 11 3/4. So I am going to line up my 11 3/4 mark down here on the fold. I'm going to make sure that I have my lines running along my cut edges. That one, and cut off the ends. Do the same thing on this one. 11 3/4. Lines running along the long cut edge. And cut. Oops. The other 2 pieces need to be cut down to 25.5 inches. I want to make sure everything stays aligned, so if it moved on you, straighten it back out. So half of 25.5 is 12 3/4, so exactly the same process, the 12 3/4 mark down on the short end, and lines running along my long cut edge. And as long as you had this straight when you folded it, you should not have a V where the fold is. And mine's straight. Next, we're going to take the 23.5-inch strips and sew them to both sides of the house block using a 1/4-inch seam. Once we have added the 23.5-inch strips to the sides, press the seams toward the border, and then we're going to add the 25.5-inch strips to the top and bottom of the quilt exactly the same way. And after they're stitched on, again press toward the border. Once you have your pink border sewn on and pressed toward the borders, then go ahead and stay stitch around the outside edge about 1/8 of an inch away. You want it inside the seam allowance. The pattern says set the stitch length for a long stitch length. I disagree with that. I stay stitch with my regular length stitch. A long stitch is a gathering stitch. It's up to you, but I did it at my regular. It's 2.5 on my sewing machine. In your kit this month is a piece of yellow fabric that's around 3 by 13 inches. From that fabric, we are going to make the centers for the flowers that we made several months ago. You actually are going to want to prep 6 centers, and I'm just going to do a quick recap on this. Whatever you used for your template the last time, you can use that. You can use cardboard, you can use your heat-resistant template plastic, the Mylar. I'm using my perfect circles because I have them. You're just going to trace them onto the wrong side of the fabric. Make sure you leave space between for your seam allowance. Then you're going to cut out the pieces, leaving a 1/4 inch seam allowance all the way around. Next, you're going to baste in the seam allowance with thread that will pull up. We put the template in the middle of that and pull up the thread and knot it off. And then we used our starch, our best press, our spray sizing, whatever you like. And once again, we're going to spray it into a small container. Use a paintbrush. Paint all the way around so that the seam allowance is wet, and then we're going to press it dry. And once it's dry, then you can just clip the threads and pop the template out. You will need 6 of these circles. You can do them the same size as we did for our pinwheel blocks, or you can pick a different size. I'm using 1.5 inches. Remember those 5 petals we made several months ago and set aside? They are going to go onto the house block, and so is one of the centers. I arranged mine how I think I want them, and you can play with them, come up with your own ideas, or you can look at the picture that you get this month in your kit. Then I went in and I drew my lines for where I want the stems to go. You can just draw those in freehand if you want to. You could draw them out on paper. I have this flexible rule that I used. I can make the shape I want and test it and then decide whether I like it or not. So that's what I used. Sometimes we have them in the store. You can also get them in places that carry drafting supplies, office supply stores. Now I'm taking the bias that we made last month and I'm going to place it along the lines. I usually like to mark my bias lines with just one mark, and I use that on the inside curve whenever possible, because it's easier to stitch down your inside curve and then come back into your outside curve. So I did leave it hanging over the grass right here. What I'm going to do is tear out a few stitches and then tuck it into the seam. You could fold it under. I'm just placing it along the line and pinning it in place. And then I will clip it off. I want to make sure that I have enough stem that it's going to go under the pieces. I don't want to turn it under up here, so I just want to make it stick far enough up that it'll go under that circle. And then just cut off the extra. And we're going to stitch it down with the same stitch we've used to stitch down the circles and the petals. So and I'm using matching thread. I've sewn down the first vine, and as you can see, I did pop the stitches and bring it through. I have not stitched it down yet. If I could get in there with the sewing machine, I would usually go back and just sew the seam back shut, but since we have a seam crossing it so close, I'm not going to be able to open it up enough, so I will just applique this green down on the top when I do the leaves. I'm going to pin the second vine on, again, just one side following my drawn line, and stitch it down exactly the same way. After the stems are stitched down, then you can go ahead and add your flower petals, and you can arrange that however you want. I did it a little differently than what it was on the picture. I did put my center down to make sure that they all fit under it. And you can start putting leaves down as well. There will definitely be more than this. We need to add our yellow centers to the flower. When you are appliquing with light colored fabric, that might be white or yellow. Sometimes you have issues with shadow through. The darker fabric will show through on the back. So you can put lightweight interfacing on the wrong side. You could slide a piece of muslin in there. I've decided to just use a thin piece of batting. I cut the circle just a little bit smaller than the applique circle, and then I just tucked it inside. I have already done that on this circle and stitched it down, and it gives it just a little bit of puff, so kind of a trapunto effect. It also takes care of the shadow through. Don't feel like you have to use the batting if you don't want to, but I would recommend that you back your circle with something so that your brown stems and your red don't show through. Once the leaves and everything are placed on the center, it's finished and we're ready to add our next border. The next border is made up of the pinwheel blocks and the floating squares. I would suggest that you lay them out until you're happy with the arrangement, and then we're going to sew them together with 3 floating squares and 2 pinwheels on each side. Once you have sewn your side borders together, then press the seams toward the floating blocks, and then we're going to put together the top and bottom borders. We're going to press toward the floating blocks. Once you stitch your borders on, then the seams get pressed in toward the pink border. Our next border is the flying geese. There are 7 on each side. Arrange them the way you want. I arranged them in the same order on each side. That's just the way my brain works. You are certainly welcome to do them just randomly. They're just going to be sewn together end to end, and then the seams are pressed open. From the end of each row on the flying geese unit on both ends, you need to unpick the seam and take the white triangle off the end so that you have the pieces that look like I have here on the floor. The white triangles are now scrap. So 1 flying geese unit to each of the sides of the quilts. The cutoff end on the triangles should just line up with the straight edge of the quilt. You will have an angled corner. The seams, after you sew the flying geese units onto the center of the quilt, are pressed toward the pinwheel blocks. I just want to point out that the flying geese are the same width as the blocks are, so those seams should be matching up as you're going. So if you need to ease, you should probably be easing between those seams. You have a white strip or strips in your kit this month, and from that we need to cut 4 2.5-inch strips. I have already starched and pressed my white piece, and I already clean cut one edge. So 2.5. Oh, once again, my ruler was not long enough, so I have folded it in half. So I'm going to line up a line always on the fold. 2.5 times 2 is 5, and then I'm going to cut it in half. We are not trimming down the length at all. And my white piece is probably a little bigger than yours because I saved the piece to do 2. Because I always do 1 for the video and usually 1 for the demo, although we're wrapping up this month, so. And so again, don't worry about trimming down the length. We're going to sew the white strips to the sides of the quilt. We want it to hang over on the corners, so just kind of center it on there and stitch it on. Okay, the pattern says to mark continuing the angle from the blue triangles. out onto the white and then cut. You can do that if you want to. I see no point in marking first, so as long as you're comfortable, just cut those off, extending out your blue triangles. And we're going to do that on all 4 sides. On our petal corners that we did many months ago, we want to trim the long edge so that it is about 1/2 to 3/4 of an inch away from the lowest petal. But we also still want to make sure that we have at least 10.5 inches on the short edges. So on mine, I measured down 3/4 of an inch, and I did mark it, and I checked, and to that black mark I have a little more than 10.5. So, but then you also want to put it on your piece and make sure that we're not going to cut. Lay it up next to the quilt, make sure you're not going to cut into the petals. It's going to work for me to cut it at 10 3/4. We cut this block originally at about 12 inches, so I'm cutting off just a hair more than 1/2 inch on the long side. Just wanted to show you real quick. You just want to make sure that if you extend this cut line out here and here, that you're not cutting your flower off. You should still have at least a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and I'm okay. So what I'm going to do is fold this in half, find the center, and match it up to the center of my corner, and then sew it on with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. I've sewn my corners on, and I press the seam toward the corner because there's less bulk there. Now we just need to trim off the extra that's still here on the corner. I am using a square ruler. You don't have to, but that way everything just stays square. I just want to trim my extra off even with the edges here and here. So when you're happy that you have it lined up, and you want to make sure that you have at least a 1/4 of an inch sticking out beyond your flower, which I do. I'm going to trim, and do that for all 4 sides. Now we're going to arrange the side and the top border. The side borders each use 5 cornered square and square blocks and 4 of the red star blocks, and then the top border uses 6 star blocks and 5 cornered square and square blocks. Just arrange them till you're happy with them, and then sew together the side ones first, and that will go onto the side of the quilt, and then the top one will go onto it afterwards. Now take all 11 hexagon blocks and arrange them how you want them, and they are sewed together in a row and sewn to the bottom of the quilt. You can press the seams any way you want. You can press them to one side, you can press them away from the center, you can press them open, that's up to you. And once the row is sewn onto the bottom of the quilt, the seam gets pressed in towards our white border. Once the hexagons are sewn to the bottom of the quilt and the seam is pressed toward the white, I do recommend that you stay stitch around the edge of the quilt. It's going to be handled a lot. Then it's time to put our vines onto all 4 sides in the narrow white border. They are going to be tucked up under the centers of the red flower, so make sure you get them under there. I used my flex curve again to mark out my line for my vines. You don't have to do with that. You can have them as regular or irregular as you want. They can cross over into the other blocks. It's up to you. I would suggest that it might be helpful to take the vine you have left after doing the center and cut it into 4 sections. That brown piece on the left is all I had left after I got done putting the vines on. So since I hadn't divided mine into 4, it was getting a little bit iffy. The next thing is to put our leaves on. So divide the leaves you have left into 4 groups so that's kind of even, and then just place them on each side however you want them and stitch them down. Once you have positioned and stitched down all your leaves the way you want them, the very last step in finishing the top is to put centers on the flowers. And I am going to put batting in my flower centers again, just like I did on the house part. So here it is finished. It's quilted and bound. The pattern called for 2-inch wide binding cut. I actually cut mine 2 1/4. You can do whatever you choose. a half a yard is plenty to do whatever width binding you want. So I hope you had fun, and I hope you like the quilt.